show is for immediate...
Wait a minute. Have you heard?
This is a show to keep you on the edge of your seat.
Citizens of America,
Welcome to the Radiocast.
Hello and welcome to the Radiocast show, the podcast show where the staff here at ECAT talk about the movies and shows that we have in our old-time movie and old-time TV show. For this month of October, we did two movies for a sort of a Halloween creature double feature. And the first film we will be talking about is 1922's Nosferatu by F.W. Murnau. Alongside me is Joe Taft.
Thank you for having me.
And Adam Carrero.
Hi there.
Nosferatu 1922 is considered by many to be the first feature-length major vampire film, and also by others to be the first Dracula adaptation, which is something we'll get into when we talk about the movie's production. But it is a very old horror film, and it's still, even to this day, considered a very influential classic, like for the genre of horror, and that's something I'll get into later, sort of the legacy that this movie has had, but it has had a very long-lasting legacy that we still see even today. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, me too. This movie definitely has a long-lasting legacy, as Jack said, considering we have an actual Nosferatu adaptation coming out later this year. And, you know, I think that when it comes to vampire movies, you really don't see one nowadays that doesn't have a little bit of Nosferatu in there somewhere. So, yeah, I'm really excited to talk about it, and I think Adam might have some questions for us, some baseline questions, if get right into it.
Yeah, get right into it. But yeah, it's one of those movies that it is well known, but it's the Dracula creature, I guess you can say, isn't like, well, not like, but like, you don't see those costumes at Halloween like you do like the original like Frankenstein, the creature from the lagoon.
Yeah,
the
Lagoon.
Black Lagoon. Yeah, the werewolf. Like you don't really see that kind of, but it's definitely a creature that is well known and
classic,
and gets used like throughout the history.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like what was the, I don't know, either when was the first time you saw the movie, or like how were you guys introduced to this movie?
The first time I ever heard about Nosferatu was actually from a SpongeBob SquarePants episode.
Same.
It's the episode where they are staying late at work at night, and throughout the episode there's someone flicking on and off the lights, and at the end it's revealed to just be this stop motion paper cut out of Nosferatu, the vampire, Count Orlok, who's just there flipping the lights, and it was just one of those out of nowhere left field jokes that they just threw into an early SpongeBob episode. And I remember just asking my parents, who is that? And they're like, oh, that's just Nosferatu. And eventually I'd learn like, oh yeah, like Nosferatu was a old vampire film, which I forget how old I was when I watched it. It was on a collection of horror films, because there was a time my brother and I where we went through a phase when we were young where we were watching like all the old like classic black and white horror movies, especially the Universal ones, and we got like this DVD that supposedly had 50 classics on it, but most of them were awful because it was only public domain movies. But it did have a few good ones, and Nosferatu was one of them. I forget how old we were when we saw it, but it had to be like middle school, I think.
Wow.
Then later when I went to college and we were doing like a film history class and talked about early cinema, like we also watched Nosferatu in that class and talked about it as like an early example of a cinema, especially when it comes to horror and like German expressionism and all that. So that's sort of my history when it comes to Nosferatu.
Yeah, I also did first get introduced to Nosferatu through SpongeBob, as I think many people around our age probably did. But when it comes to the actual viewing of this film, this was my first watch, which is, I think, kind of funny, but also is probably not unlike what a lot of people, I think there's probably a lot of people who haven't seen this movie from that are around our age. They've probably never taken the time to just, throw it on and see what it's all about. It's the second oldest movie I've ever seen, second to The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is also a German expressionism horror film. And my question for you is, when it comes to the few viewings that you've had, were they the same version? And would you like to get into a little bit about the different versions of this movie?
Yeah, that is something we talked about before the podcast. Is you said the version you watched was very choppy and the quality wasn't as great. And yeah, when I was picking this movie for this show, of course I knew Nosferatu was in the public domain, but there's sort of some loopholes to that, because there are a lot of versions you can find online, but those are versions that have been restored, like they're higher quality, there's some color correction, the titles are different, and those versions are, I believe, are copyrighted, so I couldn't use those. So if you just look up Nosferatu, you'll find many versions of it. The one I picked for this show was the earliest version I could find that hadn't been altered or restored,
and was also in the public domain.
And that was in the public domain, right. And also looked good, because I did find some other versions, but those were of really bad quality. You could barely see what was happening. So the reason Nosferatu, I believe, fell into the public domain, because, as I said, many people consider it to be a Dracula adaptation because it shares pretty much the same plot of Dracula with some differences, because the film was a unauthorized adaptation of the novel Dracula. Right. And that led to the the studio and the movie makers getting sued by Bram Stoker's widow, because they did not ask her at all, hey, can we basically take the story of your husband's novel and just make our own movie? That actually led to a 7-year legal battle between them, which resulted in, during which the studio filed for bankruptcy, and the Stoker estate won, and part of the requirements was that every copy of Nosferatu needed to be destroyed. But during that time span, the movie had gotten out to other countries. It had been sent to America and England, where it was translated into English. And that's how Nosferatu, the film, survived. But kind of because of that, there are no original copies of the film left, as far as I know. It's mostly just bootlegged or a secondhand versions. And the one that we picked for the YouTube page, actually the characters are not named the characters are supposed to be. The vampire's supposed to be named Count Orlok, but in this version he's called Dracula, because when it came to America, a lot of people some movie distributors did just translate it as a straight-on Dracula adaptation.
Yeah, which they were able to get away with. I think that there's an element to these silent films where you are banking quite a bit on the title cards and to know what is happening. I mean, it would be interesting to watch the movie without any title cards and just to kind of go from there and see how it feels. But depending on what version you see and what title cards it is, because when I watched the version I watched, which is on Tubi, and then when I went over and checked the YouTube version, it wasn't even that just the names were different. It was the entire title card could have been completely different. And so one thing I remember being really confused about was why the character named Knock had been he went crazy, and I didn't really know why. And then when I went back and watched a little bit from the one that's on our YouTube, it said that Orlok's spell had impacted him from afar, something along those lines, where there was never a line like that in the version that I watched. Now, what I thought was funny about the version that I watched, was that the movie looked if you were to take just the frames of the movie, it looked really good. The shadows were good. The lighting was good. It looked solid, but for some reason it looked like it was running at 1 frame per second, where it almost kind of looked like stop motion photography. They had taken a bunch of pictures and just laid them out in a row. Where then when I watched the YouTube version that we have uploaded to our channel, it was much smoother. But at the same time, the title cards were much cleaner and much more modern in the version that I watched. So, which is probably like a copyrighted version where they remastered a lot of it. And so the title cards had a completely black background, and the words looked very clear, and it didn't look very old like the version on our YouTube. The title cards look pretty old. I don't really know exactly. Like there's like it's like not complete black. It's like gray.
Yeah.
Right. And so that was one difference where I realized that, man, like depending on what these title cards actually say, you could influence your audience into thinking pretty much anything.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why, especially silent films nowadays, some people don't resonate them with it as much because, as you said, you can watch one version of a film and it can tell a very different version of events from the other one. And some people just don't enjoy reading when they watch a movie, which is a topic for a discussion for a different day. But yeah, like about the film itself. So as I said, it kind of is like it follows sort of the basic outline of Dracula, where a young real estate agent goes to this castle in Transylvania to meet with a count, in this version called Orlok, who wishes to move to, in this version, Germany instead of England. And while there discovers he's a vampire, and then the count himself travels back to that person's hometown and starts wreaking havoc. And this film, which kind of makes it unique from other vampires' stories, is there's a lot of connection between the vampire and illness, like where he travels, a plague follows him.
Yes.
And I was reading about why that happened, like why the filmmakers made that decision, and I believe it's because the director F.W. Murnau, the producer Albin Grau, and even the lead actor Max Schreck all served in World War I, specifically in trench warfare, where there was a lot where one of the biggest dangers of trench warfare was diseases and rats.
Yep.
So I think that may have influenced the decision to include that symbolism by connecting the vampire with a virus that's spreading.
Yeah. There was, I have to say, a few things that there were a few things that I had questions about while watching, and I think that maybe because of the certain title cards that I had versus the title cards that other viewers might have, maybe I would have better answers. But that character Knock, who went crazy, he didn't have the plague, right?
No.
So in my viewing, I said, okay, so there's the plague, which is plaguing the city or town that they live in by the end when they're carrying all the caskets down the street. And then there's also this other thing that Count Orlok kind of emits to other people and drives them crazy, which you had with Hutter, you had with Ellen, even though Ellen was nowhere near any of them, right? I think she felt that more on a metaphysical level, like she was able to feel what Hutter was feeling, where she woke up in the middle of the night and was going crazy. And then you had Knock, who, when I asked my dad, I was watching a movie with my dad, and he was like, well, he held the letter. I was like, okay, so just by was it just by holding this letter was enough to kind of get the Count Orlok sickness? That's where I was a little bit thrown, because he never interacted with the guy.
Yeah, that part of the film is always, I think that's a bit of an example of sort of the issues that silent films can have when it comes to certain elements of storytelling. Is the character of Knock is based on a character from the Dracula book called Renfield, who in the book is this madman inside a insane asylum, which does eventually happen to Knock, who sort of who becomes Dracula's servant. In the movie, it's implied that he's already under Orlok's spell, because if you look at the letter that Orlok sent to him, and people have analyzed that letter, it's covered in a lot of strange,
weird markings.
Markings, kind of demonic symbols.
Yeah.
Kind of implying that they have their own secret language. That So it kind of implies that they've been talking for a bit. So maybe sometime before the movie, Locke already came under Orlok's spell. But yeah, that part of the film, I do agree that part isn't as explained, which might just be an example of sort of the limits that silent films had when it came to storytelling. Wasn't able to like explain the backstory of that subplot.
That does make. Oh, go ahead.
I was saying now with silent movies, because this was one thing I always thought was interesting, that you kind of can tell with horror movies the way it's going. Like you had Freddy and Jason being slashers, and Saw came out, now it's gruesome. But when the original, I guess, horror creatures like Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman came out, they kind of had a look for them, but they kind of told a story. But with this one being a silent movie and you couldn't really tell the story because of the slides, and being a horror movie, how do you think they portrayed it to be like a horror movie for people to go see?
Well, I'd say back then, what was considered scary back then, it's probably not scary nowadays. People were a lot more easy. It was more easy to scare people with film back then because film was something new. So just having like a vampire just look like how Orlok does in the film and have those like what to do with the ending, like with him in the shadows, like that enough was like that by itself was enough to scare people.
And the super long fingernails and the eye makeup and the shadows definitely were probably enough time because we're so overexposed to stuff nowadays where like, you know, it's much harder to get a scare out of somebody, but not even a scare, like, you know, it's not like there were any jump scares in a movie like this back in the day. It wasn't about like, ooh, gotcha. It was like trying to like invoke a different sense of horror. It's more of a tonal.
Yeah, kind of more like a I'm struggling. I had the word, but then I forgot
like
it.
Atmospheric.
Yeah, like atmospheric.
Like, yeah, exactly.
And gothic atmosphere.
Yeah, definitely.
That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah. There's definitely more of an element of that where, and also I think that the fact that this is an adaptation, it had kind of a, well, you know, for legal reasons or for not, a checklist of what it needed to accomplish throughout, you know, like, the real estate agent goes to Transylvania, which also I thought was interesting that it was Transylvania and they didn't actually try changing that, but they did change the country that they lived in. But so to me, like I was already familiar with the story of Dracula, and I knew about like the Demeter, as it's called, or Demeter story, and how but so what I thought, let's get into that a little bit about the ship, where the shipsmen, as they're referred to in the version I watched, or no, first it was the raft, you know, like the raft that they were on at first, so they called them the raftsmen. But anyways, the on the ship, I forget the name of it in this, but it's based off the Demeter, right? And so I was confused as to why in the context of this movie, why did Count Orlok need to take a ship? Because my question is, one, he was like driving a carriage, you know, he was in control of a carriage when he picked up Hutter outside his house. And then he got on the ship, and that took longer than it took Hutter to get back to his house. And so obviously there's a clear path, not clear, and it's definitely probably a long journey, but from Transylvania to Hutter's town. So Nosferatu decided to, he took the long route by taking a ship. Now, if you would say it's because, he had 6 coffins and not one. Well, at the end of the movie, we only see him carrying the one coffin across the city, which was probably the funniest part of the movie. But I just thought there was an element of like, it felt, maybe it's because there wasn't enough explanation in the title cards, but it felt like there was a little bit of a plot hole going on. And I'm not somebody who truly deeply cares about plot holes that much most of the time. But I was like, you were riding on there was also a few continuity errors that were very funny. But like, he was riding on a carriage earlier in the movie, and which had, I'm assuming, room enough for 6 coffins in the back. And then he decided to take the ship, and so maybe he didn't know the way to
Well, I think
Germany.
the issue is that as seen in the end of the movie, sunlight kills him, so he can't travel during the day. So if he was just traveling in a carriage, he'd have to like find a place to hide every time the sun comes up, so he doesn't die. So if he just loads everything on a ship and hides in the bottom of it, then he can just sail all the way to England to Germany and not get exposed. I think it is mentioned, at least in the version I watched, it mentioned that the ship had to stop a few times along the way. And every time, and also it is mentioned everywhere it went, a plague would spread throughout that port.
Right. I remember it saying that one of the islands, they heard about the plague and they wouldn't allow the ship to stop there. I guess that would make sense. So I think, I appreciate that we're having this conversation because these are just some baseline questions that I had throughout the watching. And I think that if it were a movie, maybe a movie that didn't have, like maybe if it wasn't a silent movie, it wouldn't be so tough to pick up on some of these things. I guess I did think from the very beginning, I remember saying to my dad when it comes to like, why was Knock going crazy? It was like, to me, it seems like these guys are already crazy. Like they're already kind of tapped out. I mean, the way that Hutter was reacting, his expressions were wild, and Knock as well. I was like, so he can read that, you know? So maybe I just should have. Also, I think when things happen earlier in the movie, it's easy to like forget them by the end. With our iPad kid attention spans.
Well, I will say, especially when it comes to Hutter, I think that might have just been an example of a silent actor overacting, which
I thought so, yeah.
was very, very common in silent films because they couldn't talk, so they had to express every emotion through like their body language, their face, how they wave their arms, which did lead to a lot of overacting. Yeah, at least what we would consider overacting in silent films. It's kind of interesting that like the most subtle and preserved performance in the movie is actually
for me, I thought it was Ellen.
I was gonna say, like, in terms of just like body language, it's kind of interesting that the most preserved performance is actually by the vampire himself, Max Schreck.
Yeah, no, you're right. I was thinking of all the characters outside of him, where Max Schreck, he was subtle and creepy in like a lot of effective ways, especially for the time. There were moments where I'm like, man, he doesn't even look real. You know what I mean?
It's funny. It's funny you mentioned that because earlier, Adam, you asked about how audiences are scared. Back then, no one had ever actually seen anything like what Max Schreck looks like as Orlok like before, because films were new, so they just saw like this horrifying looking creature. It led to a rumor, and it kind of became like an urban legend that Max Schreck himself was actually a real life vampire, and it was just like this urban legend that sprung up because people at the time were like, "There's no way that could be a normal human in that film." So like he got the job done, and people thought he was a real vampire.
Most definitely. I want to go back to the performances of the actors who played Hutter and Ellen, where I could feel like her, and this is 100 years ago plus now at this point, but I could literally feel like the actress like feeling as though he was overacting, like in the scenes, like where she's just like, because if you noticed, like the Hutter actor would literally talk like during his takes, like he would start saying things. He'd literally be opening his mouth like talking, but we can't hear him, right? While the Ellen, and he did that multiple times, where the Ellen actress never, like, she knew that she was on a movie that wasn't going to have any words, you know what I mean? And so maybe he was just like lost in the character and kind of just doing it, but he was definitely saying things, or at least moving his mouth, and it's like, well, that's not going to come across, right? So it was like, I felt the embarrassment like through the screen a little bit. But I felt like she gave the most, so it was Greta Schroeder. Preys on the wife of his real estate agent. Yeah, Greta Schroeder. I think she played Ellen. She was pretty effective. I felt like throughout the movie she was bringing a lot of different emotions, and it's harder to portray those emotions when you don't have any words, at least for some actors. And so I thought she did a really good job. Well, a lot of the other male characters were a little bit goofy, but there were just some really funny scenes too along the way. Like, for example, the scene where the angry mob is chasing Knock around the city, I think that was because he strangled the custodian.
Yeah,
that was kind of random and funny. I thought that custodian, like, there's a lot of characters in this movie that I'm like, well, that was a smart decision, sarcastically. But I don't know if there's any scenes in particular that you would like to talk about.
Yeah, I think like the most iconic scene from the movie is the ending where Orlok's shadow is on the wall. Like when we see him going up the stairs and then his shadow with the long nails reaching for the door. I do believe that is generally considered the most iconic scene from the movie.
Yeah, most likely. My other question, though.
Yeah, that is an image that even nowadays you'll still see people show that image and reference it. And I remember even as a kid, I found that very creepy.
Yeah, I would say so. You knew it was coming. You know what I mean? You knew we were right there at the finale. But hadn't Hutter, like, at least in the order of the movie that I saw, it was like Hutter had just like ran out of the room to go find the doctor. Because
isn't I think another thing another example of silent film not being able to really get the message across too well is that Ellen pretended to be sick and told Hutter to go get the doctor so he would leave so that she could lure Orlok over and basically trap him until the sun comes up.
I did kind of get that element of it where she had read the book and she knew also the book was very convenient, right, where it literally like it was like they were literally reading Bram Stoker's Dracula, like, oh, so that's how I do that. But no, I'm talking more so about the element where she was like, go get the doctor, while I thought that Orlok was already on his way over.
Yeah, I think
so. It was like they must have like passed each other in the hallway type, you know what I mean? Maybe it was just the order of scenes.
Oh yeah, she does open her window and then tells him to leave. Yeah. So I think they did. I think Orlok probably waited for him to leave and then decided to sneak in.
Orlok's just waiting outside the door, like he just like watches him run by. He's like, "Oh, I'm in." I thought that was kind of funny. They probably were very close in proximity, and there were some funny moments where like. With the book where I was like, wow, that's really convenient. And then it turns out that he like stole the book from like the hotel he was staying in earlier, or like kind of the inn. Because when he went to stay in this, I guess you could call it an inn where like they're serving food and drinks, and then like he stays there. And those are the people who told him like, don't go to Transylvania. They're creepy people. And he goes in the room and he's reading the book about Nosferatu. And then he like throws it on the ground, which I was like, why'd you do that? But then later, like he pulls the book back out and he's reading it again. And so I'm like, oh, so he totally stole that book from the hotel, which I thought was kind of funny. But yeah, overall, man, I mean, I think that it was just like, I appreciate some of the explanations that you've given me because, I mean, I was a little bit, like, it felt like they were like kind of like they had taken the novel of Dracula and kind of just like checked the boxes that they needed to check to make a movie adaptation. Where I think now some of it makes a little bit more sense, but I do think there's a lot of room to play with it because like with this upcoming version that Robert Eggers is doing, we're talking about he's making an adaptation of an adaptation. So I think he has a lot of room to play with, but also like to for all the plot points to make sense, right? Like to not be as maybe confused throughout, but also if you've seen a Robert Eggers movie, you usually need a couple watches to fully get the whole picture.
Yeah, and while on the topic of the upcoming remake, I wanted to briefly mention sort of the legacy that Nosferatu has had as a film. This upcoming Robert Eggers film is not the first remake of Nosferatu. There was a 1979 German remake by the director Werner Herzog, which...
Yes, correct. Yes, my dad talked about that one as well, yeah.
Yeah, that's a famous remake. There's also, recently, there's like a crowdfunded remake where basically it's just like a silent film as well, where they kind of like actors in front of a green screen just recreating scenes.
Right.
Like that was like a low budget remake that came out a few years ago. And also just in terms of like the legacy of Orlok as a character, his very much like bat-like inhuman look has still nowadays you can see vampire characters that are influenced by that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen What We Do in the Shadows, but
the show.
The show and the movie both
okay.
have like vampire characters who are based off the at least visually the character of Count Orlok.
The Max Schreck version, yeah.
Yeah, and
cool.
also have you heard of the Stephen King story Salem's Lot?
I have, yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the TV show though, or yeah, it was a series, right?
Yeah. Slight spoiler: it is about vampires.
Okay, yeah.
And in the 70s, a miniseries of that, like in the book, the vampire from that, he speaks, he looks like a normal person, but in the miniseries, they changed him to look more like a Nosferatu-ish vampire.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And that was also a change that even in the remake, the adaptation of Salem's Lot that just came out this year, the vampire still has that look, the Orlok look. So that is like still a vampire design this movie started that we're still seeing even today.
It's legendary. It's a legendary look, you know what I mean? And I think that considering where we are over 100 years later, the fact that people are still taking influence from that, it speaks volumes. Would you like to ride us right on into the break?
Into the sunset.
Please.
No, but yeah, definitely it's a movie that still got reference, and like you said, another remake's coming out this year, so it's something that continues to be referenced and be remembered, even though it's a silent movie, but it's still making noise in the movie industry.
Good reference.
Yeah. So we're going to take a slight break, and when we come back, we'll continue with our discussion for the other old-time movie that we did this month.
So welcome back, folks, to the Radiocast. Right now, we are going to be talking about the 1960 film City of the Dead, and I'll hand it off to Mr. Jack Kelleher.
Yeah, this was a film I had heard about but never seen, and when we were coming up to October and I decided to do a Creature Double feature, I thought like, oh, now now might be a good time to do City of the Dead. And yeah, for those who haven't seen it, then you probably shouldn't be listening to this podcast, then watch it first. City of the Dead is about at least for the first half of it, is about a college student in Massachusetts who travels to a fictional town called Westwood.
Yeah, Westwood.
Yeah, Westwood, to research witchcraft, only to discover that the town's inhabitants are witches themselves. It may sound like a bit of a basic plot, which, yeah, like it is a simple story, and we'll get to more of some of the plot details in a little bit, but I found it to be like a good, like effective old black and white horror film. What did you think, Adam?
Yeah, it was definitely a good horror film. Like for that era, like nowadays you'd probably watch this movie and think it more as a mystery, like a crime mystery somewhat, with a horror twist of it because it wasn't so gruesome. But definitely, and I think they probably didn't totally discuss it in the movie because it was a time length, but being around this area and being with the Salem witch trials, you kind of got the basis of the beginning of it. So you kind of understood what was going on, why she was getting pulled from the crowd, and why the town turned on the woman. They didn't totally explain it. They were just like, she's a witch. And so like, if you're out of the New England area, you're like, all right, what's the big thing with witches? But this was filmed in England, which still, I think that type of witch, not lifestyle, but that witch, like
The folklore,
yeah, was still present in Europe. So even that, like they didn't have to go deep in detail for it. So it was kind of just, they showed it and they kind of explained like the plot of the town, of what was going on for it. But it definitely kept like you intrigued to like how she was going to stumble upon stuff going through it.
Yeah, the opening scene of this film features a witch being burned at the stake. Elizabeth Sewin, I believe was the character's name. And I will say this film kind of does perpetuate the, I think, fake narrative that in Salem they burned witches, which they did not.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that was something that there were a lot of executions when it came to the Salem witch trials, but no one was ever burned at the stake. And yet still today we see, usually when people talk about witches getting caught, they're like, burn the witch, which isn't something that actually happened in Salem, but for some reason they keep adding it into movies and stuff. But
I think it was just more the gory-esque of all, like the demonstrations that to prove that she was a witch.
Yeah.
Like not dunking them in water, so if they floated, they're a witch, and like the other stuff that they used.
Yeah, it definitely is a gruesome opening for a 1960 movie. Just having this woman being like burned alive while she's cursing the town and like crying out for Lucifer to like answer her calls and curse the town, which might as well mention now, the film was made in England, and when it was sent over to America, well, not only did they change the title to Horror Hotel, which makes it sound like a completely different movie, but the censors at the time, they really censored Elizabeth's opening monologue where she curses the town. They like any line where she mentions Lucifer or Satan, they cut that line, which probably made the film harder to follow because they basically cut out her cursing the town, which I found funny because then you'd watch the rest of the movie and be like, wait, why is all this happening? Because they cut out the part where she actually curses the town. Yeah,
and even on IMDb, you can watch the original trailer as the U.S. version. So when they call it Horror Hotel, and like just watching the trailer, they put all the plot points in the trailer. So watching it and you watch the movie, it's like, oh, I really saw what happened the whole entire movie in the trailer. But yeah, they made it more like it wasn't so much of a witch. It was just more of like a cult. Like the town was in a cult, really. Yeah,
it is an interesting depiction of witches where, because in the film we see both female and male witches.
Right.
Like it's not really like a gender specific term in this film because, like, besides Elizabeth, as we come to find out, the entire town mostly is people who have sold their souls to the devil, pretty much, are immortal and have to sacrifice people in order to keep this deal going, and they include Elizabeth and like male members of the town, like one of which is the main character, at least the initial main character, is a professor who is played by Christopher Lee.
Yeah, which I did not like recognize at all until because they're so used to nowadays him with a beard in all his movies because of his age. So to see him that, you don't really realize it's him.
Yeah, I will kind of take a little break of talk about the movie just to talk about Christopher Lee because he was one of my main. He was one of the main reasons I chose this movie because I really want to talk about Christopher Lee because he's probably one of my favorite actors and he's just like someone who I find to be very fascinating because like before he was an actor, he served in World War II, and I don't know if you saw a recent trailers for a movie called the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare that came out last year.
I did see that trailer.
Yeah, that was based off of a real-life World War II espionage group that worked for Winston Churchill, and Christopher Lee was actually a part of that in real life, and he served alongside his cousin Ian Fleming, who would later go on to write the James Bond novels.
Right.
And Christopher Lee himself actually was one of many people who inspired James Bond. And during the war, he served in Africa. He was in Sicily. And after the war, he helped to hunt down Nazis. He's also a direct descendant of the Holy Roman Emperor who brought Christianity to the Roman Empire, Charlemagne, and he just kind of has had a fascinating life. So and I really enjoy seeing him in every movie he's in. So when I saw there's a Christopher Lee movie in public domain, I'll choose that. Yeah, and he kind of in this movie plays, as I said, the professor of the girl who is studying witchcraft, and he's the one who sends her to the town. But as we find out later, he is a member of the cult, and this was all just a trap to ensnare a sacrifice for them to kill.
Yeah, and like once you really find out what what's happening, you kind of really realize like, oh, he's basically like the trap master because he lives forever, so he can keep going to one college after another and keep sending people down this way. But to go back to why the censors, and like I said, like outside of New England and the England country, the witchcraft, not a lot of people knew. So like anything like back then, talk about the devil and everything else, I could see why the rest of the U.S. wasn't that knowledgeable of it. And they're like, I know we got to cut this. But instead of be like, well, no, this is why this was like back then. This is what they talked about then.
And a pretty important part of the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty much setting up the rest of the movie that this is a town that has been cursed by this witch who, and in the modern day, it's inhabited by witches who are like, one of whom is a reincarnation of that first witch. So like if you skip the whole part of her cursing the town, the rest of the film doesn't make as much sense. I think the censoring happened mostly because people found the mentionings of the devil too shocking at the time.
Yeah, and still going through that, even leading to with music in the 80s.
Yeah. And
some would argue you still have some of that today.
Yeah.
yeah, and so this student, her name is Nan, she is interested in studying witchcraft, so she goes to this town that her professor recommends she visit, which is a site of a famous witch burning, and she gets there and automatically it's very quickly obvious that something is not right. Everyone in the town is acting weird. Like when she's just walking down the street, everyone will just stop and stare at her, like, which I found to be pretty creepy. And also it is constantly filled with fog.
Yeah.
Like every part of this town is just completely covered in smoke and fog. Even the insides of buildings have fog in it. I don't think I've ever seen a movie that has had as much fog in it as this movie does.
Well, I don't know if it's because everything was filmed inside of a studio set. So I don't know if they just constantly used fog and the studio couldn't like vent it out. So it was just like the fog was stuck in the building no matter how they shot it.
That might have been a thing, but I think it does help the film to stand out. It does give the town a very creepy and unique look, especially like when we see the sort of witch cult moving through the graveyard, just these shadowy hooded figures moving through the fog, like a backlit, but like the street lights. It does create a pretty effective image.
And the one thing with the town too is, so throughout like the movie, so when everybody tries to find how to get to this place, they always stop at this one gas station, which I'm wondering if the gas, well, he kind of warned people not to go to the town, so I guess he wasn't part of the cult, but he knew where to find the hotel. But when the girl's missing and the brother and the boyfriend calls the operator to get to the hotel, the operator's like, oh, there's no such thing as that hotel. But the gas station person knows it, and the police is like, oh, let's call the police. And the police is like, all right, we're going to go to this hotel. And they're like outside the hotel. So it's like, so everybody knows about this place, but yeah, it's not like
it doesn't
physically listing.
It doesn't have a landline.
Yeah, no landline.
It was interesting kind of seeing that gas station person, because that's kind of a very common character trope in horror movies, especially slasher films.
Yeah.
Was like, say like in Friday the 13th, the teens on their way to the summer camp, they'll stop and someone's like, oh, you don't want to go down there, bad things happen there.
Yeah.
That's like a character trope that's very much kind of blew up in like the 80s and 90s in like every slasher film. So
there was also kind of a character like that in Nosferatu, not to bring it back, but like when he stays at that inn, the guy running the place was like, yeah, you don't want to go there. Yeah,
that's kind of just a very common trope in horror films, and it's kind of what's interesting to see that in this. And also, speaking of tropes and going back to Christopher Lee, how you mentioned he was kind of the guy who ensnared the victims. Lee would later go on to play a very similar role in another horror movie called The Wicker Man. Have you heard of that?
I've heard that. Was that Nicolas Cage?
No, that is, well, yeah, that is, Nicolas Cage film is a remake of an earlier film, which had Christopher Lee. And in that movie, not spoiler, he is also a part of a demonic cult, and they're there to entrap a victim for sacrifice. And I was surprised watching City of the Dead. I was like, this is very similar to The Wicker Man. I was like, Christopher Lee enjoyed playing these roles, it seemed.
Well, he eventually was Star Wars and during joined another cult of the Empire. And
That's
Lord
actually
of the
true.
Rings.
Yeah.
He likes joining like evil cults.
Yeah, and also bring it back to Nosferatu. One of the roles Christopher Lee is most famous for is for playing Dracula. He played Dracula in close to 6 or 7 films for like Hammer Studios.
Okay.
In like the early 50s, going into the 60s, he played Dracula for over a decade, and I believe he was still in those movies when this one was made. I know by the end he hated being in them because he thought the scripts were garbage, but yeah,
well, it's a little bit of typecasting too, right?
Yeah,
it's like,
that was,
I'm gonna play Dracula again.
Yeah, that's why he hated it. He wanted to do other stuff.
Yep.
But
meanwhile, he goes off to do his third like satanic cult movie.
I do know of a movie where it's about a satanic cult, but he's actually the guy trying to stop the cult instead of the leader. So I'll have to check out that movie to see him do something different. But yeah, getting back to City of the Dead, we've kind of been dancing around it, but yeah, the main student, Nan, she dies like halfway through the movie. Yeah, the film pulls a psycho and kills off his main character about halfway through the movie.
Which I thought was, at the time, I was like, oh, all right. And the boyfriend and the brother goes to the town. And this is one of those kind of movies, and we talked about this too, like some of these older movies is they get a good storyline and then they kind of get pushed to the deadline of when the movie should end, and they just kind of rush everything, and then that's what causes more questions. Because when everything was going down at the end, it kind of showed people coming up from the graves, and I thought it was going to be the main character coming back dead, but we really don't see that.
I think anyone came out of a grave. Like, I know, like, the brother, like, the witches, when he was driving, the witches made him crash his car.
Right.
So, like, I think he did have to, like, rise out of the ground, sort of. Are you referring to when he, like, picked up the cross to, like...
Yeah, a little around that scene. There was, like, people coming up. Or was it were they...
I think it might have been the other cult members who were, like...
hiding behind the stones?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because remember, like, when the brother, when he gets in, he's, like, running through the graveyard, you see on the gravestones all the names of the people who are supposed to be alive in the town.
Right, okay.
And like Christopher Lee's character's name is there as well.
Okay, because I guess that's kind of tough with black and white, because the lighting, you can't really tell what's a cloak and what's really like a shadow of a person.
I was gonna say Adam saw the deleted scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, like maybe there was someone rising out of a grave. I saw this movie I watched it a few weeks ago in preparation for this, so I may be forgetting it.
No, it could have been somebody in a cloak and they were hiding behind the tomb to make it look like they were popping out of the grave. But being a black and white movie, you really can't tell what's, like, if something's not lit right, you can't really tell what's going on it. And that was another thing, being black and white too, and the lighting, is the boyfriend and the brother. The brother was supposed to look older, but because I think the boyfriend's hair was so light, and with being black and white, he looked like he had white hair. So the boyfriend looked older than the brother.
Yeah, I can see how that. I can see how that could happen.
Yeah, it's just like, it's one of those things, like black and white. Yeah, that's all they had.
Right. There were a few shots too, not to keep going back to Nosferatu. There were a couple shots in Nosferatu where it looked like they used like an infrared camera, where for some reason the shots seemed to be like inverted in color, so the trees were all white and like the sky was black. It was kind of bizarre, but yeah, that can when you aren't, we take a lot for granted today in how cameras are able to capture such a wide range of colors and brightnesses and things of that nature. So I think that sometimes it is kind of charming to go back to the time where they didn't necessarily always have as much control, and if they made like one mistake, you could see that the image looked completely different.
Yeah, this was a low budget film, I believe. It didn't have, or at least by that standards, it wasn't considered too high of a budget. So
No, I thought I had that. That it wasn't anything dramatic. 45,000 euros. Apparently, they didn't want to put it in American dollars.
Yeah, because it was a British made movie,
Right.
which part of the reason, part of the fact that because it's made in England but set in Massachusetts, everyone had to do an American accent, which I guess Christopher Lee was doing an American accent. It just kind of sounded like his normal voice,
Right.
So he might have been trying one. I couldn't really tell.
So some part of British, like England, I think you could get away with being pretty close. Like, granted, there are probably some areas of England that's like, no, that's a thick accent of like Liverpool or some other part of the country. But if they're all like theater majors out of London, like Christopher Lee was, like, they could probably do it enough to make it pass.
Yeah, most of the other cast of this movie were mostly stage actors. I was looking at their filmography, and a few of them were like in other stuff, but nothing really major. Lee was I think the only actor who was really going to have like a extensive career, because after this he would play Dracula a few more times. He would eventually be a James Bond villain. He'd be in Star Wars. He'd be in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, that's probably the only one that jumped out.
Which is probably why, even though he's a supporting character, he's not even the main villain. But in most of the posters of the movie, they'll like put his face like front and center on it, even though he's technically not the main villain or the main character.
He was kind of the big get. So do you know when his acting career began?
He started acting when he was 25, which was right after... all the stuff I mentioned earlier, him fighting World War II, inspiring James Bond, hunting Nazis. He did all that before he was 25. Then he decided, I'll give acting a try.
Yeah. He was quite literally the most interesting man in the world.
Yeah, that is something I agree with.
Yeah. There's also, to go back to the Christopher Lee stories, there's the two that they talk about with Lord of the Rings, where the one about him knowing
how to stab.
What to sound like when you're stabbed in the back.
Yeah, there's a famous story told on the set of Lord of the Rings when Peter Jackson was explaining to him when his character Saruman gets stabbed in the back. Spoiler alert.
Well, it's only in the extended version, so it's okay.
Spoiler alert for the extended edition, but Peter Jackson's like, okay, when you get stabbed, you're going to make this sound. And Lee was like, I have heard, and Lee was like, do you know what sound a man makes when you stab him in the back? He's like, because I do. And here's the sound I should make. And Peter Jackson, when he tells that story, is like, he said that, and that was the end of that conversation.
Right. Yeah. And the other, I think, interesting thing about Christopher Lee with that is that he claimed to have met J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yeah, he was a big fan of Lord of the Rings, and he had met Tolkien in the past. He was the only cast member of the Jackson films who had actually met Tolkien. Mm-hmm. And when he heard they were making the movies, he actually wanted to play the role of Gandalf at first, but Jackson thought with like his age and sort of his reputation, he would be better suited as Saruman.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you didn't have Ian McKellen, for Gandalf, he probably would have been a decent play. But also at the same time, I think he fits that Saruman character very well. But it is so interesting to think that, and he said that he met him like by chance in a bar. So it's kind of funny that it wasn't like a meeting of two people who were very famous or anything. No, it was like he just met him by chance, which is very funny. Getting back to this movie, though, what do you guys think about how the plot went from being focused on one character to then that character dying, and how do you think the rest of the movie played out from like a plot perspective, and were you as attached to the second half of the movie as you were the first half?
I was definitely interested to see what would happen, like because after that the brother and the boyfriend go to town to look for her, and there's this store owner who lives in the town who her grandfather's the priest, and he's like the only one he's an old blind priest who refuses to leave because he wants to try and fight the wishes. And she ends up later in the film that the priest's granddaughter, she's the one who the cult tries to sacrifice next. So I was interested to see that. Also, I was wondering if there's gonna be like a reveal of like what happened to the first girl, because all we see is like the witches pull her onto like an altar, they're holding a knife, they stab down the knife, and it cuts to someone stabbing a cake at a birthday party.
Yeah, of course.
In a pretty good edit. Yeah. So I was kind of wondering if there's going to be sort of like a twist, like maybe she didn't die, or maybe she's a witch now, which it doesn't end up happening. But I will say I was interested to see what would happen in the second half.
Yeah, it was definitely like you continue to watch the story and see how it pans out to see if they get caught or if more people find out about this town. It's just really dramatically changed when all it needed was the shadow of the cross to kill all the witches, and that's when it was like, oh, this is how they're gonna end it. Okay, and just kind of.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a rush climax where it's kind of like all they need to do is beat the witches. It's just like put the shadow of a cross on them, and then they all burst into flames. Which probably for back then was a lot of like fire stunts. Yeah, there's a lot of fire stunts at the end of the climax. I'll give them that. For a 1960 film, you don't see that a whole lot.
No, especially doing it in a studio shoot too.
Yeah.
So that was very kind of questionable how they were doing it there. But like leading up to that, it was still like definitely a mystery story that you just didn't know. So I think they still had that edge to keep the viewer to watch it. And I think just by the end of it, that's probably when they kind of lost people. And then that's when the word of mouth kind of was just like, it was a good movie until the end. And it just didn't keep building up.
Fair. Do you think that the fact, at least when it comes to the midway point and wanting to be able to watch the rest of the movie, do you think that because it's a mystery kind of leads into that? Like, oh, I want to know what happens next. Where if it wasn't a mystery movie, it might be a little bit different in terms of wanting to finish it.
Probably to keep just the plot line moving.
Maybe there could have been a bit more mystery because kind of in the second half, like, like, oh, the witches. Cause, well, it's kind of a bit obvious because, like, we see in the opening scene this witch getting burned, and when Nan gets to the town and goes into the inn, the owner of the inn is the same actress. So it is kind of like, oh, so she's a witch.
So it was more just like you didn't know if other people knew she was a witch or if she was going to get caught from like the outside people. Because it was almost like what was the M. Night Shyamalan movie with the Joaquin Phoenix?
The Village?
The Village, yeah. It's like everybody in the village knew everything, but no one outside of the village knew what was going on. It was that kind of same essence that all the village people knew, but you didn't know outside of the village if they did know it.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, because I see we're kind of getting close to the time, I just kind of want to talk a bit about the legacy of the movie, which I was surprised to see. This movie was very popular. It seemed to be very popular among like rock, like heavy metal bands, because Rob Zombie's song Dragula uses like sound bits from this movie, specifically Christopher Lee. The heavy metal band Iron Maiden uses scenes in their music video Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter. A Danish singer called King Diamond used clips in his song Sleepless Nights, and even in 2017, a band called In the Moment used clips for their song The Witching Hour. So this movie seems to have quite a following among heavy metal rock bands, which is an interesting connection.
Yeah, because I think just the whole kind of where it was coming from being witches in that well known, because later Rob Zombie did a movie about the Salem witches. So so I think pulling from that, I think that's why it still has that kind of culture growing.
Yeah, and I wonder if because most of these people seem to be like 50s to 60s. They probably like grew up watching this movie like when they were kids. So later on, when they do songs that have similar subject matter, they'll like reference it or like draw parallels to it as an inspiration.
It does kind of feel like the through line of these two movies, and if we have any advice to our audience, would be watch out for the shadows because they'll get you every time. I think that's going to put a wrap on this episode of the Radiocast. So I had a great time doing it. I hope you guys did as well. Thank you all very much for tuning in. For everybody back at the studio, hope you have a wonderful Halloween. And make sure to watch some scary movies along the way. Take it easy, guys.